The war lasted 11 months, and by the end of it, the Valkyrie Dominion existed only in memory. It began with a battle at the edge of their territory, where Thaxfer threw his finest warships against the human fleet and watched them burn one by one. The humans did not fight like any species he had ever encountered. They did not form neat lines or follow predictable patterns. They swarmed and retreated and flanked and ambushed. They sacrificed ships to take out larger targets. They rammed their vessels into enemy stations rather than let them be captured in the first week. The Valkyrie lost 30% of their fleet. In the first month, they lost 60%. By the third month, Thaxfer was dead, killed when a human pilot crashed a damaged fighter directly into the bridge of his command ship. The pilot had been hit by weapons fire and could have ejected to safety, but instead, she aimed her burning craft at the one spot where sensors showed the commander might be standing. Her last transmission was named Sarah Cole. Age 11. New Providence Colony. The humans did not forget. They did not forgive. And they absolutely did not stop. Kethril survived the destruction of Thaxver's ship by being in a different section when the fighter hit. She was captured by human marines who treated her wounds and gave her food and water and asked her questions about Valkyrie military positions. She told them everything, not because they tortured her. They did not because they threatened her. They were almost gentle in their questioning. She told them because she had seen what was coming and she wanted it to end. She told them because the look in their eyes when they asked about New Providence made her understand that this war would only stop when one side was completely destroyed, and she did not want it to be hers. The war spread across Valkyrie space like fire through dry grass. Colony after colony fell to human forces, who seemed to appear from nowhere, strike hard, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Supply lines were cut, communication networks disrupted, commanders assassinated by soldiers who crept through shadows and killed without sound. The Valkyrie had never fought an enemy like this. The species they conquered had armies and navies and clear chains of command. You destroyed their military and their government surrendered. Simple and clean and efficient. Humans did not work that way. When their armies were destroyed, they formed smaller groups and kept fighting. When their commanders were killed, new ones stepped up to take their place. When they ran out of weapons, they made new ones from whatever they could find. When they ran out of soldiers, they trained civilians who had never held a gun before. A Valkyrie general named Rathkol conquered a human colony in the 5th month of the war and declared victory. 3 weeks later, he was dead, killed by a bomb planted by a human grandmother who smiled at him every morning when he walked past her shop. The humans called it resistance. The Valkyrie called it madness. But whatever name you gave it, the result was the same. You could not hold human territory without killing every human in it, and there were always more humans. Always more angry, desperate, determined creatures who would rather die fighting than live under alien rule. By the 8th month, Valkyrie commanders were sending messages to Earth, begging for the peace talks to resume. They asked specifically for General Marcus Cole. They were told he had died in the New Providence attack. Not from the initial bombardment, but from a heart attack 3 days later when he received confirmation that his granddaughter was among the dead. The humans did not send another old soldier to negotiate. They did not send anyone. They just kept coming. The war ended when human forces reached the Valkyrie homeworld, a planet called Valkar Prime that had not seen enemy soldiers in 10,000 years. The defense fleet fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned and exhausted from months of losing. The final battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, human ships filled the sky above a world of 4 billion Valkyrie, who waited in terror for the bombs to fall. The bombs never came. Instead, human soldiers landed, millions of them, And they began this slow, methodical work of occupation. They dismantled military installations and arrested war leaders and established new governments made up of Valkyrie who had opposed the invasion of human space. They did not commit genocide. They did not burn cities or slaughter civilians or take revenge for the 50,000 humans who had died on New Providence. They were remarkably merciful for a species that had just fought 11 months of total war, but they made sure the Valkyrie would never forget. Every Valkyrie child, for the next 100 years, would be taught about the human warning, would learn the story of an old soldier named Marcus Cole who came in peace and was laughed at, would understand that humanity sent their tired and wounded to first contact meetings, not as an insult, but as a gift that should never be refused. The new Valkyrie government was given exactly one instruction from Earth. Remember us. Tell every species you ever conquered what happens when you ignore the warning. Spread the story across the galaxy so that no one else has to learn this lesson the way you did. We do not want to do this again, but we will. Centuries passed, and the story of Marcus Cole became legend across 1,000 worlds. Species who encountered humans for the first time would look at their delegations and feel relief when they saw old soldiers among them, scarred and tired and hoping for peace, because that meant there was still time. That meant humanity still believed talking was better than fighting. The old soldiers would smile when they saw that relief, because they understood what it meant. It meant the lesson had been learned. It meant the warning had been heard. In military academies across the galaxy, young officers studied human warfare with a mixture of fascination and horror. They learned about trenches and nuclear weapons and guerrilla tactics. They learned about a species that had spent its entire history fighting itself and had gotten terrifyingly good at it. And they learned one phrase that was translated into every known language, carved into monuments on 100 worlds, taught to children as the most important lesson the galaxy had ever learned. We do not want war, but we have never forgotten how to wage it. On Earth, a statue stands in the Memorial Garden at New Providence. Rebuilt and renamed after the war, 50,000 names are carved into its base. One for every human who died in the attack that started everything. At the center of the garden stands a bronze figure of an old man in a worn uniform, his face tired but kind, his hand extended in a gesture of peace. The plaque beneath him reads simply, General Marcus Cole. The warning, he gave them a chance. Every year on the anniversary of the attack, thousands of humans gather at the memorial to remember what was lost and what was won. And every year, a few Valkyrie make the journey too, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, their scales bowed in something that might be shame or gratitude. Or both. They come to pay their respects to the old soldier who tried to save them from themselves. They come to remember the lesson their ancestors learned too late. They come to make sure they never forget, because in the end, that is all any warning can do. It can give you a chance. What you do with that chance is up to you. Thanks for listening to Kethros report and felt something he had not felt in 300 years of conquest. Doubt it lasted exactly 10 seconds before his pride crushed it beneath the weight of 2 centuries of unbroken victory. You have let their propaganda frighten you, he said dismissively as he pushed her datapad back across the desk. These humans are clever. I will grant them that. They have created records designed to make enemies afraid, designed to make species like us hesitate. Commander, Kethron began, but he silenced her with a raised claw. I have conquered species that claim to be unconquerable, he growled. I have broken warriors who swore they would never kneel. I have watched empires crumble before the might of the Valkyrie, and not once in all my years, have I failed. He stood and towered over her, his 4 eyes burning with cold fire. These humans live 80 years and die from diseases we eliminated millennia ago. They are fragile and soft and weak. Their only advantage is their willingness to die, and that is not an advantage. That is a flaw. That is the mark of creatures too stupid to know when they are beaten. Catherall opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes told her that argument would only bring punishment. "Return to your station," he commanded, "and prepare targeting solutions for the human colony designated New Providence. 50,000 humans living on a mining outpost at the edge of their territory." "Commander," Catherall whispered with horror in her voice. "The negotiations are not yet concluded. The negotiations are over," Taxfer declared. "The humans sent an old man to beg for mercy, and I will show them what mercy looks like in the eyes of the Velkari. I will burn their colony and scatter its ashes across the void, and then we will see if they still want to fight or if they will kneel like every other species we have." Encountered, he turned away from her and stared out at the stars. "Give the order." New Providence died 6 hours later. The Velkari warship appeared in orbit without warning and opened fire before the colonists even knew they were under attack. Plasma beams cut through habitation domes and mining facilities. Explosions tore through streets where children had been playing moments before. Fires burned in the vacuum as atmosphere vented from 100 breaches. 50,000 humans lived on New Providence by the time the attack was over. That number was Zarathaxfer watched the destruction from his command chamber and felt the familiar satisfaction of dominance, of power, of absolute control over life and death. "Send a message to Earth," he commanded. "Tell them this is what happens to species that send old men instead of tributes. Tell them their colony died because they were too proud to kneel. Tell them the Velkari Dominion demands their unconditional surrender within 30 standard days, or we will do the same to every human settlement we can find." His officers obeyed, and the message was sent, and Taxfer settled back to wait for the inevitable response. The begging and pleading, and desperate offers of peace that always came after a demonstration of power. He waited 1 day, and there was silence. He waited 2 days, and there was silence. He waited 3 days, and his confidence began to crack. On the 4th day, a message arrived from Earth, but it was not the surrender he had expected. It was a single image. A photograph of an old man standing in front of a wall covered with smaller photographs, each one showing a different human face. General Marcus Cole stood in the picture, and he was not smiling anymore. Beneath the image was a single line of text: "My granddaughter was on New Providence." Taxfer stared at the message and felt the first real stab of unease pierce through his arrogance. "What does this mean?" he demanded of his communications officer. Before anyone could answer, the sensors began screaming. Ships were appearing at the edge of Velkari space. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Vessels that should not exist according to every intelligence report. Warships that had been hidden away in reserve fleets that Taxfer had never known about. They were not like the human ships he had studied. Not the fragile transport craft and primitive patrol vessels he had dismissed as beneath his notice. These ships were built for one purpose, and one purpose only: war. Transmission came through, and Taxfer accepted it with hands that had begun to tremble, though he would never admit it. General Cole appeared on the screen, and his face was stone. "Commander Taxfer," he said in a voice that held no warmth and no hope, and no mercy at all. "I told you. I was the warning. I told you what would happen if you ignored me. I begged you to choose peace." His eyes were not the eyes of a tired old man anymore. They were the eyes of something ancient and terrible and very, very angry. "My granddaughter was 11 years old," Cole continued. "She liked to draw pictures of stars and dream about exploring the galaxy. She wanted to meet alien species and learn about other cultures. She wanted to believe that the universe was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. His voice cracked slightly, but his expression did not change. You burned her alive while she was sleeping in her bed. He leaned closer to the camera, and Thaxfer found himself stepping back without meaning to. I want you to understand something, Commander. I did not fail today. I succeeded in my mission completely. My mission was to give you a chance, to prove to my own people that we tried diplomacy, to show them that we extended a hand before the fist started flying. Now my conscience is clear. Now no one can say we did not try. Cole straightened and gestured to someone off screen. The soldiers coming for you now are not old men. Daxfer, they are not warnings. They are young, and they are angry, and many of them had family on New Providence, just like I did. They are coming for blood, and I could not stop them, even if I wanted to. Which I do not. The transmission began to fade, and Cole spoke his final words. Goodbye. Commander, I hope your gods are more merciful than mine. The screen went dark, and Thaxfer stood alone in his command chamber as alarms blared and his officers shouted reports about the approaching human fleet he had conquered. 200 species. He had never once considered that he might be the one to fall, but as he watched the human warships grow closer on his sensors, their weapons charging and their course set straight for his heart, he finally understood what Kethril had tried to tell him. The old soldier had not been weak. The old soldier had been kind, and kindness from humans was a gift that should never be refused, because what came after was so much worse. Kethril was the finest science officer in the Valkyrie fleet, and she had analyzed hundreds of species before their conquest, learning their weaknesses and calculating exactly how much force would be needed to break them. When Thaxfer handed her the human data chip, she expected to complete her analysis within a few hours at most. That was 3 days ago, and she had not slept since. The data chip contained everything, absolutely everything. Every war that humans had ever recorded, every weapon they had invented, every battle fought, and every life lost in their long bloody history of violence against themselves. At first, Kethril had watched with the clinical detachment of a scientist to studying primitive creatures. Then the numbers started to sink in on her. Detachment began to crack the First World War, they called it. A conflict that erupted over political alliances and pride. And Kethril watched footage of trenches stretching across continents where men lived in mud and filth for years. She saw them charge across open ground into walls of bullets, knowing they would die. She saw chemical weapons melt their lungs and burn their skin and blind their eyes, and still they kept fighting. 4 years that war lasted, and 17 million humans died, and when it was over, they called it the war to end all wars. 20 years later, they started another one. The Second World War was worse, so much worse. And Kethril found herself unable to look away as the horrors unfolded on her screen. She watched cities burn under falling bombs, watched soldiers freeze to death in winter battles that lasted months, watched humans load other humans into trains and send them to camps where they were worked to death or simply killed in chambers designed for mass murder. 6 years that war lasted, and 70 million humans died, and at the end of it, they invented a weapon that could destroy an entire city in a single flash of light. They used it twice. Kethril paused the footage and stared at the mushroom cloud rising over a place called Hiroshima, and she felt something she had never felt before in all her years of analyzing conquered species. Fear, real fear. These creatures killed 200,000 of their own kind in an instant, and then they did it again. 3 days later, just to prove they could. They created a weapon capable of ending all life on their planet, and they kept building more of them. thousands more, pointing them at each other and waiting to see who would blink first. But that was not what frightened Kethril the most. What frightened her was what came after. The humans did not stop. They could not stop. Even with weapons capable of destroying their entire species, they kept fighting in smaller wars all over their planet. They fought in jungles and deserts and mountains. They fought with rifles and explosives and chemicals. They fought for ideology and religion and resources. And sometimes for reasons that made no sense at all. She watched footage from a place called Vietnam where human soldiers walked into traps they knew were there, because refusing to walk meant giving up ground. She watched footage from a place called Stalingrad, where two armies fought over every building and every street and every pile of rubble until the city was nothing but graves. She watched footage from a place called Thermopylae where 300 soldiers held a pass against thousands because someone had to buy time for the others to escape. The humans knew they would die, and they fought anyway. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned, and they fought anyway. The humans lost hope again and again, and somehow they always found more and kept fighting anyway. Kethril began running calculations, and the numbers made her scales turn pale. In the last 500 years alone, humans had killed nearly 1 billion of their own species through war and organized violence. Not through disease or natural disaster, but through deliberate, intentional destruction of their own kind. 1 billion. And yet, there were still over 10 billion of them on their planet and more spreading to colonies across their system, breeding and growing and recovering from every wound they inflicted on themselves. She pulled up medical records next and found that humans had developed ways to repair almost any injury. They could replace lost limbs with mechanical ones. They could transplant organs from one body to another. They could bring someone back from clinical death if they reached them fast enough. The old soldier Marcus Cole had been shot 7 times and was still walking around 70 years later, because humans simply refused to let their wounded die. Kethril thought about the species the Valkyrie had conquered and realized something that made her blood run cold. Those species had fought until hope was lost and then surrendered. They calculated their odds and realized they could not win and chose survival over destruction. They were rational creatures who understood when resistance was futile. Humans were not rational. Humans did not seem to understand when hope was lost. Humans fought harder when they were losing, invented new weapons in the middle of wars, changed tactics and strategies on the fly, adapted and evolved, and refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. And worst of all, they taught their children to do the same. Kethril found recordings of human songs about glorious last stands and noble sacrifices and dying for what you believe in. She found stories they told their young ones about heroes who fought against impossible odds. She found entire cultures built around the idea that death in battle was preferable to surrender. These creatures had spent their entire existence learning how to kill and how to survive being killed and how to keep fighting even when fighting made no sense. The Valkyrie conquered species that wanted to live. The humans were a species that wanted to win, and those were not the same thing at all. Kethril gathered her data and her calculations and her growing terror and went to find Commander Thaxfer. She found him in his quarters, reviewing battle plans for the conquest of Earth, and she stood in his doorway until he looked up with annoyance in his 4 eyes. "What is it, Kethril?" he demanded. "I am busy planning our victory, Commander," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. "I have finished my analysis of the human data chip." "And," he prompted impatiently, "we cannot conquer them," she said. Thaxfer stared at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. "Explain yourself," he commanded in a voice that promised punishment for wasting his time, Kethro stepped into his quarters and placed her datapad on his desk. The species we have conquered in the past fought until hope was lost and then submitted, she said. They were rational. They calculated their chances and chose survival when victory became impossible. She pointed at the datapad with a trembling claw. Humans do not work that way. Commander, they do not seem to understand when hope is lost. They fight harder when cornered. They invent weapons mid-war. They teach their children songs about glorious last stands. She pulled up footage of a single human soldier on a bridge, holding off an enemy army while wounded and bleeding. This man knew he was going to die, she said. He knew there was no rescue coming. He knew that nothing he did would change the outcome of the war, and he fought anyway. He killed 37 enemies before they brought him down, and his last words were asking if his friends had escaped. She looked at Thaxfer with fear naked in her eyes. The old soldier Marcus Cole is not a threat. Commander, he is a mercy. He is what they send when they still want peace. Thaxfer did not know what to make of the old human, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit for centuries. He had read enemies like open books, understanding their fears and weaknesses with a single glance. But this Marcus Cole was different. This tired old creature with his faded ribbons and knowing smile. You speak in riddles. Thaxfer growled as he lowered himself into the massive chair at the head of the table. I do not have patience for games. Human. Explain yourself clearly, or this meeting ends now. Cole nodded slowly and pulled out a chair of his own, sitting down with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned to ache with every motion. Very well. Commander, he said, let me tell you a story about myself. And perhaps then you will understand why humanity sends old men like me to meet with species like yours. The Volcari warriors shifted restlessly, but Thaxfer raised a claw to silence them, his curiosity getting the better of his pride. Speak then. He commanded. Cole leaned back in his chair, and his eyes seemed to look at something far away. Something only he could see. I was born during what we called the Resource Wars, he began. A time when human nations fought each other for water and food and the right to survive. My mother died in a bombing raid when I was 6 years old. My father was killed defending a water treatment plant when I was 12. By the time I was 18, I had already learned how to fire a rifle and how to kill without hesitation. He paused and touched one of the scars on his neck, a thin white line that ran from his ear to his collar. I was conscripted into the military because there was no other choice. Because the war needed bodies, and I was young and angry and had nothing left to lose. They gave me a uniform and a weapon and pointed me at enemies who were just as desperate and afraid as I was. Thaxfer listened without interrupting, though he did not understand why any of this mattered. My first battle lasted 3 days, Cole continued. 3 days of blood and screaming and explosions that shook the earth. 3 days of watching friends die beside me while I kept firing and firing and firing because stopping meant dying. When it was over, I was one of 11 survivors from a company of 200, and I was considered lucky. He held up his hands, and Thaxfer noticed for the first time that they were covered in small scars, burns and cuts that had healed long ago but never faded. These hands have killed more humans than I can count, Cole said quietly. Enemy soldiers, and sometimes people who were not soldiers at all. Sometimes people who were just in the wrong place when the fighting reached them. I have done terrible things, Commander. Things that visit me in my dreams and make me wake up screaming. The human diplomat closest to Cole reached out and touched his shoulder gently, but he did not seem to notice. I fought in 3 major wars before I turned 30. He went on. I was shot 7 times and survived each wound through luck and medicine and pure stubborn refusal to die. I watched weapons that could level cities be used against populations who had nowhere to run. I saw humanity at its worst, and somehow kept fighting anyway. He finally looked back at Thaxfer, and his eyes were heavy with memories. Do you know what the Velkari officers were laughing at when they saw me? Commander, they were laughing at my age, and my weakness, and my broken body. But they do not understand what my scars represent. What do they represent? Thaxfer asked despite himself. Survival, Cole answered simply. Every scar on my body is a wound that should have killed me, but did not. Every year I have lived past 40 is a year that war tried to take from me and failed. I am not weak because I am old, Commander. I am old because I was never weak enough to die. He stood slowly and began unbuttoning his uniform jacket while the Velkari watched in confusion beneath. The jacket he wore a simple shirt, and when he lifted it, the aliens in the room went very still. His torso was a map of violence, covered in scars of every kind. Burn marks and bullet holes and long surgical lines where doctors had cut him open to remove pieces of metal and put him back together again. This is what a human soldier looks like, Cole said without pride or shame. This is what we do to each other, Commander. This is what we have survived for thousands of years. He lowered his shirt and put his jacket back on with slow, careful movements. The Velkari have conquered 200 species, he continued, and I am told that each conquest was swift and efficient, that your enemies saw your power and surrendered rather than face destruction. Is that correct? Thaxfer nodded stiffly, though he was beginning to feel something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Humanity does not work that way, Cole said. We do not surrender when we are outmatched. We do not give up when hope seems lost. We fight harder when we are cornered. We invent new weapons in the middle of wars. We throw ourselves onto explosives to save strangers. We keep fighting until there is nothing left of us to fight with. He picked up the data chip he had placed on the table earlier and held it out to Thaxfer. This chip contains records of every war humanity has fought against itself, he said. Not against aliens or monsters, but against each other. Brother against brother, nation against nation. Ideology against ideology. In just the last 300 years we have killed over 500 million of our own kind in organized conflicts. Thaxfer took the chip, though. His claws felt strangely numb. 500 million, he repeated. And we kept fighting, Cole confirmed. We built weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds, and we used them. We poisoned each other with chemicals that melted lungs and burned skin. We created diseases in laboratories to kill enemy populations. We did all of this to ourselves, Commander, to our own species, to people who looked just like us and spoke our languages and shared our blood. He sat back down and folded his scarred hands on the table. This is why humanity sends old soldiers to first contact meetings, he said. Not because we are weak, but because we remember. Because we know exactly what war costs. Because we have paid that price so many times that we are desperate, truly desperate, to never pay it again. You send broken creatures to negotiate peace, Thaxfer said slowly. We send those who have seen the alternative, Cole corrected him gently. We send those who have buried friends and held dying enemies in their arms. We send those who know that every war ends eventually, and the only question is how many graves we dig before it does. He leaned forward, and his eyes locked onto the commander with an intensity that belied his aged body. I am the warning, Thaxfer. I am here to tell you that humanity has spent thousands of years learning how to destroy itself, and we have gotten very good at it. I am here to beg you, one old soldier to a proud commander. Please, do not make us use those skills against you. Please, let this meeting end in peace. Please let me go home and die in my bed, knowing that I did something good with the years I had left. He fell silent, and the room was quiet except for the soft hum of the station system's. Thaxfer looked at the data chip in his claw and then at the old man who had given It to him, and for the first time in centuries, he did not know what to say. The Valkyrie warship hung in the darkness of space like a great metal beast waiting to feed. And inside its command chamber, the High Commander HFY stood tall and proud as he watched the human shuttle approach the neutral station. He had conquered 200 species across the galaxy, and each one had fallen the same way, with fear in their eyes and surrender on their lips. And he expected nothing different from these soft pink creatures called humans. His warriors stood behind him, 8 feet tall, with armored scales and claws that could tear through metal. And they clicked their mandibles in amusement as reports came in about Earth and its people. They live only 80 years, one officer reported with disbelief in his voice. Their bodies break so easily, another added while shaking his massive head. They have been fighting among themselves for their entire history, a third said, with a laugh that echoed through the chamber. HFY raised one clawed hand to silence them and turned his 4 eyes toward the viewport where the station floated against the stars. "Let us meet these humans," he commanded, "and show them what true power looks like." The neutral station had been built centuries ago by a long-dead species as a place for civilizations to meet without weapons, and its white halls had seen countless surrenders and treaties signed in blood and tears. HFY walked through those halls, now with 20 of his finest warriors behind him, their footsteps thundering against the floor, and he felt the familiar thrill of dominance rising in his chest. The doors to the meeting chamber opened, and he stepped inside to find the human delegation already waiting. There were 5 of them standing near the far end of a long table, and HFY's eyes swept across them with growing amusement. 3 wore formal clothing that marked them as diplomats, their faces trying hard to hide their fear, and 1 wore the white coat of a scientist who clutched a data pad like it might protect her. But it was the 5th human that made HFY stop and stare. He was old. This one, with white hair thin on his head and deep lines carved into his face by time, and he stood with a slight lean to one side, as if his body had long ago forgotten how to stand straight. He wore a dark uniform covered in small, colorful ribbons that meant nothing to Valkyrie eyes, and his hands, spotted with age, hung empty at his sides. No weapons, no armor, no enhancements of any kind. Just a tired old creature whose best years had clearly passed him by. HFY felt laughter building in his throat, and he did not try to stop it. The sound burst from him like thunder, deep and mocking, and his warriors joined in, until the chamber filled with their cruel amusement. The human diplomats flinched, but the old soldier did not move at all. He simply stood there watching HFY, with eyes that held something the commander could not quite read. "Is this your strongest?" HFY finally managed to say between laughs, gesturing at the old man with one massive claw. "We have heard rumors of human tenacity, and we expected more than this. We expected warriors worth conquering, not broken relics waiting to die." His warriors clicked their approval, and one of them stepped forward to tower over the old human, looking down at him like a predator examining prey too small to bother eating. The old man did not step back. He did not tremble. He did not even blink. Instead, something strange happened to his face as a small smile appeared on his lips. Not a smile of fear or submission, but something else entirely. Something that made the young Valkyrie officer suddenly feel cold despite his thick scales. "No," the old man said in a voice that was quiet but somehow filled the entire room. "I am not our strongest." He paused, and that strange smile grew just a little wider. "I am the warning." Silence fell over the chamber like a heavy blanket, and even HFY found himself unable to speak for a moment. "Warning," he finally repeated with confusion in his voice. "What warning could an old broken creature like you possibly give to the Valkyrie Dominion?" The old man reached up slowly and touched one of the ribbons on his chest. A faded thing that might once have been purple. My name is Marcus Cole, he said. General Marcus Cole of the United Earth Defense Force, retired. And I have been fighting in wars since before your youngest officer was hatched. He let his hand fall and looked directly into Thaxver's 4 eyes without fear. I have killed more of my own kind than you have conquered species, Commander, and I am considered one of the lucky ones because I survived. Because I came home when so many others did not. Because I got to grow old while better soldiers than me rotted in the ground. The diplomats behind him shifted nervously, but none of them tried to stop him from speaking. Humanity did not send me here because I am strong. Cole continued. They sent me because I am tired. Because I have buried friends and enemies alike. Because I wake up screaming from dreams of things I have done. Because I know exactly what war costs. He took one step forward, and the young Valkyrie officer actually stepped back before he could stop himself. We send old soldiers to these meetings, Commander, not to threaten but to remember. To remind ourselves what happens if peace fails. To look into the eyes of potential enemies and hope, truly hope, that we do not have to fight again. Thaxver felt his earlier amusement fading into something he did not want to name. You speak of hope, he growled. But the Valkyrie do not negotiate. We do not compromise. We conquer. I know, Cole said with a sadness in his voice that seemed genuine. That is why I am here, Commander, because someone had to try. Someone had to extend a hand before the fists are flying. Someone had to be the warning. He reached into his pocket and several Valkyrie warriors tensed, but he only pulled out a small data chip which he placed on the table between them. This contains our complete military history, he said. Every war we have fought against ourselves, every weapon we have invented, every atrocity we have committed and survived. I suggest you review it before you make any demands. Thaxver stared at the chip, and then at the old man, and then back at the chip. You show us your weaknesses, he said with suspicion in his voice. No. Commander, Cole replied as he straightened his old uniform with hands that did not shake. I show you exactly what you are dealing with, and I pray to whatever gods might be listening that you are wise enough to understand. The smile returned to his face. Tired and knowing and somehow terrible, because if you ignore this warning, the next humans you meet will not be old men hoping for peace. They will be young soldiers hungry for war, and I will not be able to stop them.